For historical context and more information, see the description below.
The latter half of the 8th century BC produced an outstanding quartet of prophets. Amos and Hosea preaching in the northern kingdom of Israel, Isaiah and Micah in the south. Amos was a shepherd from the mountain country, and Hosea was a well-to-do farmer. Isaiah was an aristocrat who was well acquainted with the upper strata of society, while Micah, we believe, was a man who was skilled in the handicrafts. All of them, of course, outstanding personalities. Interesting that Isaiah and Micah preached in Jerusalem at the same time, and yet there is no indication that they ever met each other. One of the great tragedies of preaching is that preachers do not have an opportunity to hear other preachers. We would probably be better if we did. But one explanation is that Micah lived in the small town of Marisha, and he didn't stay in Jerusalem for any long periods of time, but he was very well acquainted with the conditions that were prevalent there. He knew that the judges were corrupt, the religious leaders were hypocrites, that the property owners were without any compassion whatsoever for the poor. He said in one place, they covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them away. They are haters of the good and lovers of evil, tearing their skins from upon them and their flesh from their bones. Ye abhor justice and twist all that is straight, building Zion with blood and Jerusalem with iniquity. In his preaching, he did not specifically condemn the ceremonials of that day, but he just didn't think they were very relevant to the seriousness of the situation. His people were facing great problems that had to do with the spirit, and ceremonials were not enough to purge this. It was something much deeper that was demanded, something that had to do with the mind, something that had to do with the spirit. It is interesting that the summary of the requirements that Micah has given in that great verse of his, the summary is pretty much a summary of what had gone on with the other three prophets. Amos, you recall, had the emphasis on social justice. And he gave to us that deep verse, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. But as you read through the book of Amos, you don't find very much mercy there. You don't find very much love mingled with the justice. It was Hosea who had a very difficult experience in his own home life and had come to realize what the love of God had meant to him, that tempered this social justice with a love. So in the 6th chapter he said, I desired mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. Isaiah, the 3rd prophet, he taught justice, he taught love. They run all through his book. But probably more than either of these, he taught a great faith in God as a being who is high and a being who is lifted up. So he said, thy lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted. Micah summed up the emphasis in the words, he has showed thee, O man, what is good. And what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. It has been said by scholars But this verse of Micah's is one of 5 great high points of spiritual richness in the Old Testament. They say that the first is the one that has to do with Amos, the verse that we have just read on justice and righteousness. The second are the words that Jesus so loved from the book of Deuteronomy, and that he made pretty much the first commandment. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy might. And then also the words that he loved from Leviticus. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The fourth great section is that 4th chapter of the book of Jonah, where God is indicating his love not only for one little group of people, but for all mankind. And then, of course, the 5th is this verse from Micah. We recall that Diogenes, walking through the streets of Athens with a lantern in broad daylight, said that he was looking for an honest man. He was looking for a man of integrity, a man of moral fiber. But Micah is looking for more than that in this verse. What doth the Lord require of thee but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly? First of all, to do justly. Amos made a tremendous leap forward in this. No prophet in Israel had dared to speak as openly as Amos had spoken. Amos believed that the great crying need of his day was a social justice. Amos believed that religion had something to say to a community. It has never been easy to come by. There is a story that a fruit store was across the street from the grocer, and the grocer was tempted by some very fresh cherries that he saw in the window, and so he sent a boy over to get a pound of them. Before eating them, I suppose out of practice, he weighed them, and he found that they weighed less than a pound. So he sent back word that unless the deficiency were made up, the police would go and plead his case for him. The message came back from the fruit store. Those cherries weighed exactly the same as the pound of sugar you sold me yesterday. Fair dealings have never been easy to come by. But of course, justice has so much more to say to us than when we're thinking in terms of weights and of measures. Justice, fair dealings, they have to do with whether a man is going to be seated in Congress. They have to do with the relationship of a man and his wife. They have to do with nearly everything that we touch every day. And if this justice is to be meted out, we have to think in terms, I suppose, of the symbol that has been given down to us through the years. Themis was the goddess of equity and justice, and in Olympus she used to sit by Jupiter and help him with her counsel. She was blindfolded, as you know. She must not see the person, friend or enemy. She must not be prejudiced in any way, accepting as the facts are given to her. She must give her judgment impartially in the light of the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Justice must be meted out without prejudice. And she held in one hand a scale to balance the evidence. All judges have a very difficult task. I suppose if we were to ask people which judges we would feel had the most difficult, some would say those who work in domestic court, those who are trying to decide in family squabbles. Some would say not so. It's the person who has to pass judgment on corporation matters because they're so involved and he has to be so knowledgeable. Personally, I think the judge that has the most difficult time of it is the one who works in juvenile court, where a youngster who has just begun to live is brought before him, and he must pass judgment as to what's to happen to this youngster, knowing very well that if he makes a mistake, this may make a scar on the mind of that child for the rest of his days. Tremendous responsibility. Here's a youngster who has been brought in for stealing fruit from a fruit market. Here is another who is in his teens and he has beaten up a woman in the park. Here is another who has seriously injured a playmate. All difficult crimes. And at first it may seem as if no leniency of any kind can be given. Gradually the evidence, though, is brought in and the scale is balanced a bit, and the judge begins to see something of the other side of it. The boy who stole the fruit came from a home where the mother had been ill for months and the father hadn't been heard from for years, and the little fellow was just downright hungry. The boy in his teens who beat up the woman in the park was drunk. He came from a home where there never had been a semblance of temperance and things that were alcoholic. The boy who injured his playmate was trying out something that he saw in a gangster film on television. The judge is to do justly. He must weigh many things. And God keep him from making a mistake. For you see, on the other hand, the goddess of justice carries a sword. There are consequences if justice is not brought about. It's not a punishment that God visits upon a people. It's merely that in this Father's world there are things that will only run in a certain way, and if we're not just in our dealings, there is a sort of consequences. Jesus in the Gospel of John said, "If any man hear my word and believe not, I judge him not. For I came not to judge the world, but to save the world. He that rejecteth me and receiveth not my words hath one that judgeth him." What Jesus seems to be saying, you see, is that while he came to save rather than to judge, if repentance is refused, we bring punishment upon ourselves. He who refuses to do justly creates his own hell. Or as Studdard Kennedy once said, you don't get very far trying to buck this universe. But doing justly isn't enough. Byron said, "He who is only just is cruel. Who on earth could live if he were judged justly?" Shakespeare said, "Use every man after a desert, and who shall escape whipping?" All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Again, we go back to those words of Amos, let justice roll down with waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. Those two words coming together. But they can't stay together unless justice is tempered by an inward spirit. This Micah recognized and said, do justly, love mercy. Justice by itself can be a very cold thing, a very inflexible law based on an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And this is Old Testament. This isn't new. Jesus knew that law was not enough. Jesus knew that justice wasn't enough, so he said, be ye merciful even as your Father in heaven is merciful. Or that great passage in Shakespeare, which it would be well for us to go back and read it every now and then. Quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptered sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute of God himself, and earthly power doth then show likest God's when mercy seasons justice. What doth the Lord require of thee but to do justly, to love mercy? Season it with other than mercy, and it's seasoned with cruelty, it's seasoned with harshness, a desire for revenge, with the desire to make one pay with the last pound of flesh. We've had a good deal of that in history, and surely the past tells us that there is no future in it. Mercy, on the other hand, is the disposition to manifest compassion, to give forgiveness. It is pity. It is a willingness to help. It is forbearance. It is the man in that story, the great hunger, who went out and sowed seed in the dark of the night in the field of a neighbor who had been responsible for the killing of his daughter. And when he was asked why in the world he did it, he said, I did it because I wanted God to live. The daughter of Reverend Mrs. James Covell, who got word during the Second World War that the Japanese had killed her parents in the Philippines, who were missionaries. She was going to college in this country, and when she heard the tragic news, she decided to take up the work that her father and mother were doing, and after the war, she would go to Japan as a missionary. What doth the Lord require of thee but to do justly? Yes, but to love mercy. We mightn't have had the Second World War if we'd been able to balance those two a little after the first. And to walk humbly with God. The ability to achieve the first two depends on the last. The 5th chapter of the book of Genesis begins with the words, this is the book of the generations of Adam. Then it goes on to tell us who those generations were. Excepting for those who are interested in research, it's about as interesting a chapter as the telephone directory. One after another, there is a name, he lives, he becomes a parent, and he dies. But there's one man who stands out from all the rest. He's only mentioned 5 times in the Bible, and the most that is said of him is said in this 5th chapter of Genesis. In the 22nd verse of that 5th chapter, we are told Enoch walked with God. That's all. In this great company in the 5th chapter of Genesis, it was what set this man apart. There was evidently something different in the way this man went about the living of his life. There was a quality to his living that was distinctive. Bishop Pike, in one of his books, has said, "We are not made a people of God simply because we talk about God, simply because we engrave in God, we trust in our coins, or even because a lot of us attend church. A man's God is whatever is first in his life," end of quote. For Enoch, the answer to that was very lucid. He took his religion, he took his relationship to God so seriously that the writer picked out his name in a chapter of names and said, "This man walked with God." Micah is saying that a person must have this. He's saying that God requires this of him. When we think of walking with another, we think of companionship, we think of a sharing of ideas, we think of a relationship where there is trust and where there is confidence, and it's a rich way to comprehend a relationship with God. There are some things about him that this hurried generation are never going to see because it's moving too quickly. There are meanings for the fleeting glance, but there are also some meanings that the fleeting glance will never catch. They're understood only by those who take time to be holy. They're understood by those who have learned how to walk. He who runs through life can see only the surface of it, with H.G. Wells, who said, "I can go out and look at the stars and look at them just as I would look at a pattern of wallpaper on a waiting room of a railroad station." Takes a lot more than that, though, to be still and know. To say, "When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him?" That's something else again. God requires that we walk for him, with him, because it is in the nature of things that we cannot make the most of doing justly nor of loving mercy without it. Well, there are times that it takes more than man has in it. And there are some sitting here this morning who know that only too well. Sometimes I wonder how the Jewish people can be as forgiving as they have been of the Nazi Germans. I don't mean that they've been free from bitterness, but I do mean that they have been much freer from it than we might expect. How at times the spirits of murdered millions must cry out for justice. There could be enough bitterness in the Jewish people to destroy them, because bitterness and unwillingness to show any mercy and unwillingness to show forgiveness can boomerang and they can destroy a people.
Former Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of the late President John F.
But they're not being destroyed. Can it be because from childhood so many of them were taught the words of the great prophets? They were taught the words of Jesus, not as a Messiah, but as a great teacher. And enough of them have leaned on the faith of their fathers that they have saved a people from spiritual disaster. Without God, the great achievements of the Spirit are impossible. It's a great thing to do justly. It's a great thing to love mercy. But above all, to walk humbly with God. Because, oh God, the sea is so great, and my boat is so small. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
We presented a recording of this morning's worship service from the Shadyside Presbyterian Church, Amberson Avenue and Westminster Place in Pittsburgh. Ministers of the church are the Reverend Dr. Howard C. Scharfe, the Reverend Dr. James R. Spear, and the Reverend J. Wayne Hanreddy. Organist and choir director was Russell G. Wickman. And today's sermon by Dr. Scharfe was titled, Profiles from the Old Testament. Your comments on these services are invited. Addressed to Shadyside Presbyterian Church, and again next Sunday at 11:10. Be listening for another rebroadcast of the regular worship service from the Shadyside Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh.